Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out today. Welcome to the CU Conference on World Affairs. Today is Thursday, April 13th, 2023. It is 9:30 a.m. and this is panel number 17835, Human Rights and Climate Justice, A Path Forward Through Activism. Before we get started, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that borders on the ancestral homelands and the unceded territory of indigenous peoples who have traversed, lived, and stewarded these lands in the Boulder Valley since time immemorial. Those indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pawnee, Shoshone, and Sioux and Ute tribes. I would like to mention to the audience, if you have questions that we could ask in the Q&A session, what we'll do is throughout the session, just put your hand up if you have a question, and one of the producers will come find you and hand you a note card and a pencil to note it down, and then we will get to those at the end. Just a note that some of those may be answered in the course of the discussion by the time we get to those questions, and I may combine some of those questions as well, but we will definitely try to get all of those in. And now I would like to introduce the panel. First of all, I'm the moderator. My name is Nikhil Mankekar. I'm the past two-time chair of the Human Rights Commission with the City of Boulder, currently an appointee of Governor Polis as vice chair of the State Venture Capital Authority, where I've been working on equity and inclusion in the VC space. And now for the panelists. Next to me, we have Arielle King. She's an environmental educator, facilitator, writer, and content creator, and she's passionate about making environmentalism and law and policy inclusive and accessible to all people. She's the programming director at Black Girl Environmentalist, which is an intergenerational community dedicated to empowering Black girls, women, and non-binary people across environmental disciplines. Arielle's work is also focused on storytelling and amplifying the voices, work, and legacies of those traditionally overlooked in the mainstream environmentalism movement. Welcome to Arielle. Next, we have Gregory Crinchlow. He is an instructor in environmental design here at CU. He is an architect and an entrepreneur in underrepresented spaces. He is also the founder of Chocolate Spokes Bike Studios in 5 Points in Denver, which was named the best bike shop in Denver by 5280 magazine. Welcome. Next, we have Marlow Baines. She's an activist, an organizer, and in 2016 she began organizing in environmental justice locally and globally, and in 2019 was named the youth director of the international nonprofit The Earth Guardians, and in 2022 directed the Choose Action Now campaign, which touched 95 actions in 25 countries, reaching 40,000 people in person and through social media. And in 2020, she also self-published a book of poetry called Little Black Book, A Young Activist's Love Story. And I'm especially excited to have someone as young and is so accomplished in this movement as well on the panel. So let's give a round of applause, a big welcome to the panel. And next we'll go to Gregory. Why don't you kick us off? Each panelist will give you a little bit of time just to speak on this topic of human rights and climate justice.
Well, as I'd like to kick it off is, we look at a lot of the issues, especially of climate. Oh, sorry. It says speak into the mic. So we look at the issues of climate and human rights as not only a global issue, but from my experience as a very local issue, and investing into communities and neighborhoods to which affect us directly. And so when I approach this topic, I really try to take a lens of domestic. How do we really engage the issues that we have within our own boundaries, whether it be in the country, the state, the city, the county. And that's how I've approached this, because what we've seen is there's two sides of every story, where there is very well-represented populations. There are populations who are not well represented, that are living within a very thin distance of each other. And so how do we equalize or have equity between the two, not only as individuals, humans, but in the climate to which they live and have equal voices.
Thank you. And Arielle.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I want to start by saying that, human rights and environmentalism, the environmental justice movement really sits at that intersection, and there is so much work being done to ensure that this is a more inclusive movement that prioritizes the protection of people and planet and recognizes the inextricable links between the two. So I think it's important to note that when we're thinking about human rights and we're thinking about the intersections with climate change, there are adverse impacts to the ways that people are experiencing the climate crisis. And those who have contributed the least to the climate crisis are experiencing its impacts first and most severely. And we are seeing that all over the world. And it's a serious issue, and a lot of that has to do with ineffective planning, lack of infrastructure and investments in places that are politically overlooked, and the sometimes and historically intentional targeting of low-income and communities of color for facilities that are contributing to the climate crisis. One example of this is what we see in Cancer Alley in Louisiana. So for those who aren't familiar with Cancer Alley, it is a 85-mile corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and it has the highest concentration in the United States of chemical plants, plastic facilities, all of these things that are contributing to severe, severe health impacts for the residents who live there. There are countless examples of this happening all over the country, all over the world. And so when we're thinking about human rights and we're thinking about climate justice and climate change, we have to think about these two things in tandem. And when we're working to create advocacy, create change, we have to think holistically about both of these challenges. So I'll start with that. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you. And Marlow.
Thank you, and I'm so honored to be up here and on the stage today. And I have to acknowledge I'm definitely nervous, but very excited. I guess I kind of want to start with a bit of a story. Back when I was a freshman in high school, right before the beginning of my climate activism journey, the fire and the passion that has really driven and changed the direction of my life started at Standing Rock. And I'm just wondering, how many people know about the Standing Rock movement that happened in 2016? Okay, I'll give a quick synopsis if you don't know. Back in 2016, or a couple years prior, there was a pipeline called the Dakota Access Pipeline that was originally routed north of Bismarck, which is a predominantly white city and the capital of North Dakota. Residents were worried about their water being contaminated in the city, and so therefore the pipeline was moved adjacent to the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. And despite the same questions being raised at the reservation, this time the route didn't change. And so what happened? Indigenous groups from all across the world, plus allies, came together to defend the rights of water, air, land, and culture in order to stand up for these rights and for what we we all deserve to have. And during that time at Standing Rock, I remember seeing all the photos that were coming out, and I did have the privilege to go and support for a small time there. And during that time, I remember just being completely kind of taken aback at the difference between the police force and the land defenders. And I'm just going to try to paint a picture here. There's these photos of the police officers who are fully in their military gear with their batons. They have dogs. They had water cannons, rubber bullets. It was literally like they were waging war. And on the other side, there were these grandmothers showing up in their ribbon skirts with their sage and their prayers, and that's who was facing each other. We had the military and we had the prayer. And I remember just being so taken aback at how could these men put on their uniforms and so seriously take the job that they were doing in order to protect profit over people, over culture, over literally the stewards of this nation that we all are residing on. And it's stuck with me over the last couple years. And really where I feel most drawn to, I feel most called to, is how do we figure out to bridge these experiences? Because obviously there's a story of why the police officer decided to become a police officer. But also there's a greater story of this nation. There's a greater story of the indigenous people who resided on this land, who still exist, who are still here. And the environmental movement that we have today cannot be taken apart from the social justice that we are also trying to attain at the same time. So I'll kind of just end there, but I really am curious about what is the bridge between our stories, what is the bridge between our experiences, and how do we evolve in order to support people into moving to more of a peaceful connection with the land and each other. So thank you.
Thank you. And to the panelists, jumping off of that, when we look at the traditional environmental movement, oftentimes we see it has not been inclusive, of underrepresented people, of BIPOC folks, but also what you do see is a lot of like an emphasis on academia. So it's traditionally, like a panel like this may not have included any of you on the panel. It might have been, you got to have a PhD in climate science and just kind of doing things within that bubble in a school, and that's whose voices have been elevated, it seems, on this issue for so long. So to you all, what if you could speak about equity and what you see as the approach to build a more inclusive environmental justice movement, and I don't know whoever wants to take that.
Yeah, I can start. I first want to just acknowledge just how powerful just the Standing Rock movement was, and how it was extremely monumental for so many of us. And I think something that's so notable is that there was the ability for the residents of Northern Bismarck to just say, we don't want this. This is not safe for us, and put it somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And to have that much political capital to be able to just say no to things is a privilege. And it's a privilege that not everyone experiences, as we've seen. That's why the pipeline was rerouted in the first place. So I think that there is a strong, strong need to validate lived experience. And I think that's a really important part of making the environmental movement more inclusive. I did my senior thesis in undergrad on the Flint water crisis, and so, which, just heavy, and still isn't fully resolved. And something that I thought was extremely interesting was the first people to call out and speak about what was happening, the fact that their children had rashes all over their bodies, were mothers. There were mothers who didn't have high credentials, but they knew that something was wrong with the water because their children were feeling the impacts, right? And that was not validated until there was water testing done from multiple institutions, but most notably an institution, Virginia Tech. A group of students came from Virginia Tech all the way to Flint, and that was really the first time that it was validated that there was a water crisis. So between that and one particular doctor, Dr. Mona Hatisha, who did incredible research to ensure that people knew about how high the lead blood levels were for young people, if it weren't for them, there really wouldn't be the outcry and the public notice and awareness of the water crisis. So I think as we're navigating the continuation of environmental injustice, it's going to be extremely important to figure out ways to validate lived experience and to give credit to people who are living with injustice, and figuring out ways to platform and provide amplification for their work and the research that they're doing on their own, because so often it takes years before scientists and officials can get the funding to be able to come to their spaces and do research and identify what the actual challenges are. Another thing that I'm seeing and a trend that I'm inspired by is this idea of community-based participatory research. And so if there are going to be studies and people coming into communities, those who are working with the researchers are not simply test subjects, but they are collaboratively working with researchers to create solutions, to be co-writers on final papers and things like that. So I think that there's growth, but there's still a long way to go to ensure that environmentalism feels equitable and that all voices are being heard and considered.
Great. And Gregory.
Okay. So for me, it's, I came about this particular subject matter as a need within my own neighborhood, within my own, or within a constituent base that looked like me. Yes, I consider myself a certain amount of privilege because I've had the opportunity to have the education and the professional life. But then living in this, and then coming back into my own neighborhood and seeing buildings that are completely vacant and torn apart, which affects the climate to which people are living in. And before that we see the reinvestment in these spaces, there are a lot of people who have historic moorings in these neighborhoods. It's hard for a lot of us to see our historic values. And so how do you empower people to see that and really take claim and ownership of their spaces? Mm-hmm. And I had the opportunity to invest in the space commercially, not only as a citizen, as a resident, but a commercial entity. And I was seeing that as a bike shop, for instance, and the reason I did that is because that, for me, climate speaking, is the future to where we're going, right? How do people move through space? Right. And so, but there's a choice. There's the choice of being able to use it, and there's the need to use it. And so we were serving a lot of people who need to use it, a lot of working immigrant populations, a lot of people of color who are trying to get to interviews, jobs. And so, but then empower that population to participate with inside this space, because we designed and fabricated our own vehicles. And what does that mean to empower, create wealth, create a space that once it becomes discovered, that you're not pushed out? Mm-hmm. Because where the shop was in 5 Points, Denver, is a lot different than where it started. And it's because the empowerment has to be continuous, it has to be immersive, but it also has to start early. And so for me, it wasn't this intention to go out and understand climate issues. It was a understanding how to invest in a context to which I've already existed in, and being able to potentially scale that to other corners that need reinvestment with the lessons learned from what we did in 5 Points. And so it's an organic process for a lot of us and a lot of people in these particular communities. So.
A couple years ago, I went to COP26, and within our group, I went with the organization Earth Guardians, and within our group, we didn't actually go into the actual negotiations. We were more on the streets. And there was a kind of a drastic difference from kind of the youth that I was interacting with. The youth that were spending most of their days within the negotiations were just like completely distraught because all of these politicians and these academics, well, probably more the politicians and the negotiators, were kind of taking this more at a conceptual level, like that the climate crisis was something that we had to, they were perceiving rather than actually drawing upon the lived experiences of people and what's actually going on in the ground and in these communities. But when you go back but when you were back on the streets, I was amazed at the people and the voices that were being presented on these stages. It was the youth, it was these grassroots organizers from all across the globe, from Ecuador to the like Vancouver Island and the indigenous groups there, and people from all across the continent of Africa and within Asia and Indonesia, and it was like they were painting a whole other picture out on the streets. And so I guess what I wanted to touch on is within Earth Guardians, after kind of COP26, the group of youth that went came back to our organization and was like, we gotta do something to shift the narrative of what's being told about what's going on the ground at these COP conferences, because there is tangible action being happening on the ground all across the globe, and it's being led by indigenous groups. Yes. It's being led by people all across the continent of Africa, but those stories are not being told. Those are not being elevated. And that's what's empowering. That's what's inspiring when you actually see what's going on the ground here. And so last year, Earth Guardians organized this campaign called Choose Action Now, and the whole idea was, how do we empower grassroots groups of people? How do we support grassroots people in order to empower and tell their story to a greater public, to the greater world? And something I just want to highlight is that out of the 95 actions, more than half were happening all across the continent of Africa, and it was all different types. It was gardening, it was building bricks, it was supporting their local businesses, it was going into schools and sharing with people these other alternative careers and paths that they could take within sustainability. It was because of this global movement that we were able to have such a deep impact, but that's just often that story's not told on like a mainstream level. But when you look at the grassroots movements, it's because people care. It's because of the community members who show up and say, hey, I'm seeing something's wrong and we need to do something about it. And then all of a sudden, like, there's so much power that happens on the ground. And then it kind of gets co-opted, and sometimes, the story is changed or shifted, but at the root of almost every single action, it's because people care, and it's because community members are seeing something that they want to kind of change, and they want to change. So, and it's led. I guess the point that I also just want to drive is that it's being led typically by these communities that are being completely exploited, which are predominantly BIPOC communities. And it's happening here in Colorado within the fracking movement. So it's also in our backyard, and as Boulder residents, as predominantly a white city, it's happening around us, and we all have the responsibility to support greater action. So.
And a common theme I'm seeing in each of the responses is, as we look at the path forward through activism, as in the title of this panel, is that one, the impacts of climate change are disproportionately impacting underrepresented communities, but we also see that the response to that and the building of leadership that's happening is coming from those communities in response to the lived experience that these folks are having. If each of you could speak to how, looking at frontline community members addressing the impacts of climate change versus, theoretically things like how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and also addressing those too, but this idea of, frontline community impact and stories not getting told and people getting activated. What do you see in terms of the leadership being built? Because then when people engage in that kind of leadership, then they cross that line into not just being the community member, but then getting into that political space and getting into those spaces where traditionally those stories and voices haven't been told. But the leadership development within the movement coming from this grassroots in underrepresented communities. If you want to give time for each of you to speak to that.
Well, I'll speak to it
Start
first.
off, Gregory.
Sorry,
Yeah.
as the elder statesperson of this panel. Well, what I would say is that, because I've worked with a lot of students, and I've worked with a lot of young people in the neighborhood, and really helping them understand what's their next level and abilities and their potentials. But as they go off to, whether it be universities or other endeavors, to always look back, right, to come back and to understand the value. Oftentimes, because for me, climate is about, as an architect, yes, there are these climate issues that are very natural, that are happening within our global systems, but if you look at the local context, the climate of your own neighborhood, it can change. But if you don't have a voice, it stays in a cycle that will never change. And often we send our young people out to these experiences because they have these opportunities, but with the histories that they've experienced, they're very reluctant to come back and be part of the effort to change the neighborhood, right? And 5 Points has changed, but it's changed because a new constituent has come in and seen the resources, as opposed to the young people that had been there for years. And now those young people are out in the outer edges of Denver because they can't afford to come back and be a part of the neighborhood. And so when I talk to especially the young people that I want to really interface with, is that you're gonna have all this opportunity, but what do you do with that capital, that intellectual capital that you're gaining, and service back, right? Not only for your own community, but for yourself. Because at some point, when you're living in a community with a family of color who's been living in this house since its inception of building, and just not having the resources to upkeep, and then within a year and a half, or not even more than that, it becomes a whole new space of resource. It's heartbreaking, because why couldn't that initial family experience that, right? And so with that intellectual capital with young people and reinvesting in those spaces, seeing the value, seeing it up front, because it takes vision. And if you haven't had the opportunity to have that vision, then it's hard to see it. And so for me, the leadership comes from our young people in these communities reinvesting in their own community. And I shouldn't say their own community, in the community that they've grown up in, right? So.
Great. And Arielle.
Sure. I think a lot of times leaders don't seek out becoming leaders, especially when it comes to movement work. Frequently, they are just fed up with inaction and not being able to rely on elected officials to do their jobs and to create effective change. So when I think about leaders in frontline communities, so many of them are just like, listen, I want change, I deserve change, I believe that change is possible, and I am going to fight and advocate until change is possible, or until change exists. One challenge with that, and we're seeing that there are so many solutions, climate solutions, environmental solutions that are being led by frontline communities, being led by Black, Indigenous, people of color all over the world. The issue is resource allocation. A lot of philanthropic dollars that are going towards climate are not going towards frontline community-led organizations. They're not going toward BIPOC-led organizations. So how do we fix that? I think that's a question that we should all be thinking about, because I'm thinking about, like, for example, people who are trying to seek funds from a foundation. So many times, you know, even seeking out those funds, you can't do that until you have an invite from someone who works at the foundation, right? So, like, how do those relationships get built if people don't know who you are? And so, like, I think it's up to us as people who have privilege, who have capital, who have access, to be able to inform our neighbors, our constituents, people who have access, power, and privilege, and connect those resources. I think it's our obligation to inform others of what's happening, so that we can build a collective movement, and one that doesn't forget about those who are most impacted, and one that doesn't erase that lived experience, one that doesn't, one that just lifts up. And I think as we're thinking about the, like, just transition, for example, the transition to rely more on renewable energy resources, trying to divest from fossil fuels, there is the potential for those who have been employed by the fossil fuel industry to be left behind. And so when we're thinking about a just transition, we have to figure out ways to ensure that people who have no choice but to work in, like, the coal industry, in the fracking industry, have alternatives, and so that we can create opportunities for resource redistribution and for self-determination for communities who are most adversely impacted by environmental harm and climate capitalism and all of these other very intense systems. Yeah.
And same question, Marlow, and if you could also talk about your own pathway as a young person. Could be doing anything, but how you, what the impetus was to get so involved in this movement.
Yeah. I guess the question was, like, how do I give back? How do we give back? How do we symbiotically work together in order to support each and every voice, each and every experience, each and every person? I remember, so coming back from Standing Rock, I remember coming back into my Boulder community, and telling people about my experience at Standing Rock, and lots of times they were like, oh, that's sweet. It's really crazy what's going on there. And that's where the conversation ended. Yeah. Instead of, what can we do to support? And after that moment, it was just like, I wanted to kind of step into these places and be like, how do I elevate and support the people around me that I am hearing are not speaking as much in these meetings? Where are the people that need to, where are the voices, where are the stories, where are the experiences that are not being presented at these hearings, at these national nonprofit organizations, at these conferences? How do we support one another in order to evolve and tell a greater story and a framework in order to change? And so I think a really big part of the work that I've done over the last couple of years is learning to listen. And I think it's one of the best ways to become present in the moment, to learn more about what's going on. But actively listening means purely listening to the experiences, stories, and needs of the person in front of you. It's not trying to figure out what you're going to say next. And it's a pretty hard practice. So sometimes one of the indicators is if I find myself wanting to kind of like speak over somebody, that's a moment for me to pause and just listen. And after I'm done listening, I try to reflect on what the person said and then move forward. And when I converse, when I speak, when we all speak, trying to figure out what is a question that I can ask in order to better understand the person in front of me, to better understand, better connect with the person in front of me. And after those conversations, what am I going to do next? So I think to your question around, like, how do we, first of all, we do need more diversity in leadership everywhere. There needs to be less of a hierarchy of, like, I'm the director and you're the intern, but using even frameworks like, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it's typically when somebody's new into a job, there's this framework that's been put together where that new person, that entry-level position, is paired with also executives or directors, and it creates this symbiotic leadership position. And the person that's coming in, I mean, they're excited, they're starry-eyed, and it's going to provide a whole new way of looking at these topics and issues. And then the director probably is going to have the experience of, like, well, this is the framework, this is the procedure. But then that symbiotic relationship creates a more supportive ecosystem and network. So I guess I just really want to go back to what Gregory said, which is, how do we give back? How do we support? And what I would add is, how do we listen, reflect, and then speak more honestly and lovingly to one another? Hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, what's coming up a lot is storytelling, and who's get told and who's don't, and who's get elevated and who's don't. I would say a big shift I saw happening, you know, I was one of the founders of Indigenous Peoples Day in Boulder, the 14th city to do so at the time, but Standing Rock was also happening at that time. And so we have, just like with you, so many people I know, and even, you know, nationwide and globally, were called to action to go, like, physically go and support and find ways, you know, what do they do? Do we need tents? Do we need clothing? What else? You know, a whole movement happened around that. And what I saw was this disruption in storytelling through social media, and this democratization of storytelling, and allowing the frontline people and leadership to not have someone else elevating their own voices and other people amplifying it. And that got that story out that people may not have known, may not have seen, had it not been for getting out on social media and through these alternative channels, which then called other folks into the movement. It shone that spotlight on it. So the question to the panel is, with all the technology and all these tools we have that are disrupting these old ways, and that especially young folks are taking upon themselves to use to disrupt those old traditions, how do you see that playing into each of your work and human rights and the climate justice movement, both positive and negative?
Social media, you know, it's a tool for many purposes. I'll say that, but I've found that social media has leveled the playing field when it comes to storytelling and allowing people to tell their own stories. I also find that, you know, social media is really what you make of it. And I know that so many people in, like, my generation and Gen Z are relying on social media for news, which is kind of scary. But, you know, with that information, it's like, what do we do with that? Like, we create channels, we create opportunities for news to be disseminated on those platforms. I think that social media is pushing us to evolve, and it's allowing greater access to information. I think in the midst of book bans all over the country, in the midst of what Kimberly Crenshaw calls a war on truth, or this opportunity in opposition to just fact and history and true history, social media can be a way for young people to learn and to share and to create opportunities to overcome whatever barriers that their schools or their elected officials are placing upon their education and their access to resources. I also think that it's a great way to connect with people. I think there's, especially if you're in a place where there isn't a broad or diverse climate and environmental movement, social media can be that place for you. I have lots of friends who grew up, I went to law school in Vermont, and so, as a Black girl in Vermont, it was not a very diverse place all the time, as you might imagine. But something that I found is that I was able to not only seek out people outside of my law school community, but I was able to seek out people online. And it was a great way to share resources, share books that I've been excited about, and to teach and learn and share with others. So I think that, especially in the midst of this potential, banning of TikTok in the United States, I think TikTok in particular is a fascinating platform because a lot of other ones, the algorithms will lend itself to people who have large followings. I think on TikTok, it allows for people to get their story out to the masses in a way that other social media platforms can't. And so something that I've learned a lot about people who are on the front lines doing climate work from TikTok. and I think that when you're actively seeking out that information, it is right there in your face. And so, I would say I would implore you all to just take a look, take a gander, and see what's out there and see what resources are available. There are really incredible organizations that are spending all of their time creating resources on climate and environmental education, and lots of people who are just demonstrating what it looks like to democratize information.
Please.
I agree. Social media can be kind of a love-hate relationship
Yeah.
always. I think the most important thing in terms of utilizing this skill is what we learn online and what we are kind of receiving. How do we go back into the physical?
Yeah.
And again, this idea of give back, reciprocate. Something that happens lots of times in these institutions and structures, like our political system, like our law system, our border system, our customs system, is there's a desire to divide, keep people divided, keep people from not knowing and understanding and connecting and learning about one another. And the antidote to that is doing the opposite and coming together. And I think that's what social media provides us, is the opportunity to fit back in and be able to learn these incredible tools and skills and resources, and then sit down with your family at dinner and share with them like a book that you learned about, or a new resource or tool that you have experienced, or even experience or practice the tools that you're learning online. I think it just shifts it away from this kind of fear-based, divisive structures, and it moves it more towards an idea of evolving, growing, and creating, which is also creating life, which is also creating an evolution and a change, which we desperately need. That's the only way we're going to be able to evolve through this climate crisis, is actually facing it and kind of coming into relationship with it and with one another in order to come together and build and bridge and create a better world, pretty much. So.
Definitely,
So,
yeah.
yes, our situation, we used social media to promote, but the constituents that we were serving and still try to reach out to were so caught up in their own issues of substance abuse, trying to feed the family. Where's that next sustenance coming from? They had no time for social media. And so that wasn't really any of our kind of focus when we were working in the shop, as opposed to getting the word that we are there. But storytelling was a big part, because you'd come in and people would tell their story. They found the space a safe opportunity to say, this is where I'm coming from, this is, you know, what I'm dealing with. I had a young woman work with me, work in our shop. She was native Spanish speaking. Her father was from Ecuador and her mother was from Mexico. And so working with a lot of the working immigrant population, they would go straight to her and not even talk about anything about a bike or anything else related, but just issues. For instance, a lot of people with very high skill sets in construction industry who are afraid to open bank accounts because of the documentation process. And so, but they're very sought after because they're very skilled. And so they're putting money in their mattress and they're talking to Gabby, who's in our shop, and telling their story. But I do remember a gentleman very distinctly just fighting substance abuse. Unfortunately, we were adjacent to a liquor store, which was every block anyway. And so his story, he was a poet. And he would bring in his poems, and it would bring you to tears because you see this person that outwardly seems broken, just has no really life left. But he would write these poems at a time to where he was reflecting and having this understanding of what his life could be or others could be. But then when we talked about media and telling stories, in the beginning of the introduction, I'm going to go back to an old type of media, the magazine. And so when 5280 published that we were the best bike shop in Denver, a lot of people came to us and like, oh, this is great news. And I'm thinking to myself, this is the exact time that we need to close the shop because we have gone beyond serving and almost starting to cause the issue that's happening in our neighborhood, because now this gives license for people to say, it's okay to come to 5 Points. It's okay to buy up the property. It's okay to make it our own, because this magazine tells us it's okay, right? And so that grassroots of building up together now has been expanded. And that's on your grocery, I mean, that's not even, people aren't even buying magazines anymore. I don't even know why they print, because they just stay on the shelf. I can read the whole magazine before I check out, right? And I see that, and I was like, well, I'm gonna make a note, and I'm gonna go to 5 Points, right? And so it wasn't so much social media for us, but it was more the old techniques of communicating, and we were doing a lot of storytelling in the shop, and the storytelling was really another story. I'm storytelling was. We had a, lack for a better term, a mother going off to soccer practice with their kids but needed to get their expensive youth bikes fixed. And then I had a gang member come into the shop at the same time. And they both had a common need. They had to get something fixed. And that seemed to be something to where they could share conversation. And I'm working on these pieces, and I'm listening in the background. They are actually having a conversation. You know, there isn't, I'm sure once they stepped outside the shop, those conversations would not happen. But in that space, those stories are being told. People are becoming a little bit closer. There's this connectivity of understanding. But that wasn't from social media. That was from a physical space. That was a space that you were there, right? And so the sharing of that story really happened at that point too. So yes, we did social media. We posted quite a bit because we're a business, and that's the way you do business now. Sure. But it wasn't about that for our shop. So.
Could I add one other thing to that point? I think that's, as you mentioned, and I just kind of want to like emphasize that point around like one of the dangers of media is that idea of just kind of staying in the social media realm, right? Because it becomes consumeristic, it becomes capitalistic, because people are, they're trying to feed an audience an algorithm in order to get more views and words. And so I guess I just really want to like emphasize that point that you said around like, how do we create those spaces to have more honest conversations? Because the biggest thing that I've seen in my work, the most important piece, is you can create a whole conference about environmental activism and the tools that environmental activists need, but when those environmental activists come into that space, the most important moment of all of these conferences or the spaces that we're gathering is actually creating the space for people to be heard. and to be seen and to have those conversations, to honestly share and be vulnerable, because that's actually what then changes everybody's world. So yeah, just snaps to that whole piece around like the conversation and taking it offline.
Yeah, great. And I just want to mention to the audience, if any of you have questions, hand up high, someone will come and note your question down and get those to us. So we'll get to audience questions in a little bit. But to that point, you know, this double-edged sword of social media, it can be going in a positive direction, but there's also, it can foster a laziness in activism. We maybe call people to it who are not down for activism anyway, but they're interested in just, you know, making, you know, posting a few things. There's people who will show up at actions to, you know, to get the photo and post it. But when it comes time to, you know, to show up to those physical spaces, those meetings with political figures making decisions, we know, like, physically people showing up, that's what drives it. Like what happened on social media, it could be awesome. It's like almost doesn't exist to them. It doesn't exist to them. How do you all see that? You know, I mean, you'd led a whole global action on social media. What did you see in terms of like the outcomes and benefits of that? Was it feeding into this kind of this physical collaboration space and the way real impact can happen? To what extent is that happening? Because this is the movement of youth, this is the tool of youth, this is the way activism is being done now. And so it's quite, but to you, and then we'll go to the whole panel.
Yeah, no, I that's a great question. I think the thing that, if I'm going to be honest, disappointed me about, like the one piece that disappointed me about this amazing campaign is that so many people submitted submissions and stories and quotes in order for us to try to like support them as an organization. And something that we struggled with within Earth Guardians is literally having the financial resources, the mentorship, in order to be able to create these really engaging posts to push out to our audience. So I think that's like the one downfall sometimes of nonprofit work is like, you need the people in order to do the work. But what I can say is I was deeply amazed at the amount of people who were telling their story and who were kind of going beyond social media. So, I mean, the campaign started as like this huge, it was probably 80% of the campaign was actually preparing social media strategies and posting every single day on our stories, on our reels, on our carousel posts on Instagram. But what these people did is they got inspired, and then they went back into their communities and they organized in their schools, they organized in their local markets, they organized on their campuses, and they were, and the whole idea of Earth Guardians is actually to identify an issue within their community and then be able to gather your community to go and face it. And then Earth Guardians is trying to provide these tools and resources in order to support people to become better leaders, for these youth to become better leaders. And so on one end, I think that there was so much more, there was like even more potential to tell this deeper story of our climate justice movement. So that was like the disappointment, but on the other hand, it was happening. And so, yeah, I don't know. On one end, too, I have to say, back in 2019, we had that moment of people showing up at a rally just because it was a Greta Thunberg rally. And in Denver, so it was in Denver, Colorado, and 10,000 people showed up. And we knew that this was a great moment to emphasize Indigenous rights and the exploitation of the extractive industry on BIPOC communities within Colorado. And all of us as organizers were like, this is such a fascinating story. This is such a fascinating problem that we could all tackle and come to some crazy, amazing solutions and change some very serious things. And Greta's here, so we'll be able to kind of utilize and be able to kind of collaborate in order to create this greater change. So 10,000 people showed up, and pretty much it was like 45 minutes was around we created a panel with BIPOC people all across Colorado in order to tell this story. And we had poets that were coming out and all this stuff. But people started just chanting halfway through, like, Greta, Greta, Greta. And the media was like all getting their cameras out, like they're all ready to go. And I was like, this is not a concert. Like, I know, like, I've met Greta too. She's not here just for her name. It's to try to push forward what's going on at a global level and what we need to do in order to change climate change. And so we kept moving forward, and I do think that there was some great opportunities, and I do hope that that impacted the people who showed up. But I remember we had these calls to action, and we were like, okay, so after Greta speaks, then we'll share the calls to action. So Greta came out, and everyone was, silent and listening to her and applauding her, whistling. But as soon as her speech was done, people just started flooding out of the conference, or out of the rally. And I remember the people who were supposed to provide the demands, who were supposed to have these calls to action, were just so like heartbroken. And I remember the weeks afterwards, we just kind of sat with that. And I remember when my organizers calling me afterwards and being like, Marlow, we did the best that we can. We did the best that we can, and hopefully we created the change, but that was tough. So it's like, it's this double-edged sword of utilizing the media, but also having the discipline to also know when to step back from the screens, to step back from the editing and the reels, and getting real with one another. Because again, the real change is going to happen when we go into our communities and work together and converse and actually give back. So let's do more of that.
Absolutely. And to the audience, stay till the end. Beyonce won't come until all of them have finished speaking. Then we'll have Beyonce. Not that Beyonce, a different one. To the other panelists, if you'd like to speak to that as well, or I can go to audience questions.
I think exactly what you described is the challenge with like celebritizing activists, right? Like whatever, like there's a challenge with picking one person to be the spokesperson for a whole movement, because it diminishes the contributions, the lived experience, the value added, and just the work that everyone else is doing. The fact that a rally could happen and there was like an hour of programming that happened before Greta came on, and all people probably walked away with is remembering that they saw Greta, is a challenge. That's a challenge. And we're seeing a lot more of that with the rise of social media activists, right? And so I think that there's a level of discernment that has to happen as we are engaging with content, as we are experiencing and learning from people. There is a need to look within our communities and see who are the community leaders around us, because there are tons of them. And there are people who are doing the work right now, and we don't have to wait until we can see the Gretas of the world to be able to feel inspired by climate action. So I'll just add that.
So I'm just going to go off of what you said earlier. Tool of the youth. I'm not that. The social media is beyond me. And I allow the young people around me to actually use that. But as a person with experience, you set that example. So you give the content to which social media can disperse a positive reflection. And then hopefully within that influence, that cyber or that cyberspace becomes real time. But you have to, because if everybody's on social media, then who's doing the work, right?
Yeah.
And so, myself, who is not in youth anymore, you have to set that example. I tell it with my kids, and it's just a generation thing, because my kids navigate it well. I just don't have the patience.
Because it requires patience.
And I don't, yeah, it must.
Yeah, it totally does.
My screen time says you've been down 20% this week, and my kids are like, you've been up 80% this week. But there is that in between, because you have to accept that with technology and with every generation, things change, and it's just each generation has to be able to set the expectation for the next generation, right? And so I'm sure this generation will set the expectation for their next generation, right? But there always has to be within this social media or in some kind of cyber understanding a real space for this to happen. And I think we all need to step back and understand where that real space is for a lot of us are.
Totally.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
I guess the biggest takeaway that I took from that whole kind of like climate strike year, because it was everywhere and there were so many people and it was about the biggest rallies that you could have and how many people you could get out. What I actually took away from it is it's not about the numbers.
No.
It's not about how many people showed up to your rally if it's a success. Some of the most impactful actions and the most impactful moments of organizing have actually just been in a small room with 3 or 4 people having honest conversations about how are we going to make an impact in this moment.
Yeah.
So I guess that's just a takeaway for all the young people here. If you are wanting to get involved, remember it's not about how many followers you have on social media or how many people you have within a rally. It's more about how many hearts that you touch and how you can evolve and create those spaces in order for people to show up and feel like they can be vulnerable enough to open up and share, and then utilize, create, and drive the action from that space rather than a space of consumption and number building, because it doesn't work that way. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I would echo back on that. Most of the activism and things that have been accomplished that I've been involved in over the last decade, I never had any social media, and I didn't get on because I was so busy doing what I was doing, and I had to make a decision between do you want to be the guy who's getting stuff done and is following up to the people who show up one day shaking a fist, getting a lot of attention put on something. Someone has to do this 7 days a week after that, and I didn't have time to do the social. And then other folks who might have shown up at that beginning phase spent a lot of time building the social media, so they have these huge followings now. I've just kind of dipped my toes in, but sometimes you have to make those choices, and I think you hit the nail on the head with it wasn't about having these massive amounts of people show up. It isn't always about having massive numbers of people show up to your state legislature, your city, public town hall, your city council meetings, because at some point they get the message. Everyone is saying the same thing. Okay, a lot of people think this, but it is really about how can a small group of people be focused and strategic in making things happen, and what cuts through, in those audiences. If you have a lineup of 10 speakers, and you might have some famous folks, but it's usually the one who touches the heart of someone on an issue in activism, and that's why I asked a lot of questions about storytelling, because I think elevating those stories of frontline folks, that's what cuts through, and that's when those folks show up in these political spaces and in these traditional decision-making spaces where you don't see those voices. It cuts through all this political divisiveness we have, and it can kind of change the whole energy of the room and the way people, again, as you mentioned, listen to each other. When people stop listening, when you have someone coming in and talking about the impact in their life and talking about this is the impact on our communities of color and on my family, and this is what I'm dealing with, it can shut down a lot of the noise and the issues that we have in politics and actually create a space in which we can get things done and we can meet those call to actions and meet the moment. So we do have audience questions, but we're about to run out of time on the panel, so I definitely wanted to make sure to talk that each of you has a couple minutes to talk about next steps, calls to action. What can folks in the audience do to make an impact in climate justice and climate equity, and move forward in a way that is not in line with the so much in the traditions of the past that may have been ineffective, but what can they do to advance equity, inclusivity within the environmental and climate justice movements? Who'd like to take it first? Gregory, elder statesman.
I can start.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. I volunteered you.
The biggest thing is to be present. We tend to get caught up in our everyday existence, and we have a lot going on, all right? But to be present, to really understand things that are going around. I don't own a car, and so my presence is a lot different. And going through Denver right now is really disturbing, to be honest with you, because of all the situations we have with homelessness, mental illness, and when you're on a bike, you don't have, you're connected in some way, right? You're not protected by this piece. And so for me, being present is, I can't pass through the city without having some kind of feeling, right? To do something, to be aware of what's going on. And so, that is, for me, the biggest thing, is to be present and really see what's going on around.
Great.
Yeah, I would add to that, do your research. The history of exclusion of people of color from the environmental movement is well documented. And the people who are working right now to create impact and change is well documented. And so I think the more that, education is the most powerful tool that we have. And so the more that we're educating ourselves, the more we feel comfortable with advocating and speaking up on issues, because we feel like we have the knowledge to be able to back up anything that someone else would have to say in opposition. So I would definitely recommend just doing some more research, putting in those hours, just learning and experiencing, and not only learning from books, but talking to people and asking how can I support, and figuring out ways to best do that.
I was writing, how can I help?
Yeah.
As you said that. I want us to all think about this issue as something, it's like a triangle. It's self, it's community, and it's the earth. Mm-hmm. And how do we build our everyday practices around thinking about ourselves, the community, and the earth? And so a few things that I just wanted to kind of touch on and bring back up is, let's get used to discomfort. Mm-hmm. Let's ask ourselves to evolve through practicing what we are learning, and asking ourselves, how do we help our community? How do we help ourselves? And how do we build? There's lots of times within this climate justice space, or within this climate crisis news space, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of anxiety. And it's provoking. It makes us anxious, and if we're anxious and fearful, we can't move forward. So make sure to take your time to be outside, to connect with the world around you, and just even merely just going, like, sitting outside and feeling the breeze on your face, it forces you to listen to what's going on around you. It forces you to set the boundaries in order to even go outside and sit for 5 minutes and not pick up your phone when it rings or buzzes every single second. Mm-hmm. And then it allows you to breathe. And then I want you to take that moment that you're outside, and every moment you're feeling yourself getting stressed or anxious or scared, use those tools of actively listening, of setting boundaries, of breathing through the discomfort in order to be able to create rather than destroy.
Thank you. It's a wonderful note to end on. I want to thank Arielle King, Gregory Crinchlow, and Marlow Baines. Thank you. Let's have applause for the panel. Thank you all for coming out. I'm Nikhil Mankekar. This was Human Rights and Climate Justice, A Path Forward Through Activism. Enjoy the rest of the conference.